Hello everyone, today we complete our introduction to medieval Egyptian warfare between the 11th and the 14th century, especially finishing the iconographic evidence survey that we had began in the previous video. So we were discussing essentially those cases in which we can highlight some clear Western influence in Egyptian warfare that as we described in the last episode, was in fact quite distinct from the prevailing, let's say, Turkic and Turco-Mongolian, right, influence in the Middle East, right, especially after the Mongol invasions, the Mamluk era. Of course, we see a lot of that as well. The Turkic ghulams had already been around from a while, but indeed the Mediterranean basin had maintained a pretty strong, sound, sort of urbanized, fertile, importantly stable level of civilizational development that, in spite of, say, the Islamic turbulences due to the fact that, as you know, there is a priesthood that can check power. There are many different currents in Islam, way more than the heresies you can find within the Christendom, is also particularly pronounced in Egypt, in fact, by those same Muslim standards. And of course, during the crusading era, there were many contacts with the West. This is true before and after the same era. We will see how, of course, the same Byzantines, right? If you don't want to account them for Westerners, but again, there were lots of Frankish mercenaries, Italian Marines especially, and more. Like there was always a much sort of more similar profile of the Egyptian armies, in fact, to the same Westerners than the typical Seljuk army of an elite of heavy cavalry, cavalry almost, and horse archers as a complement. So we have a very interesting carved frieze of wooden panels stemming from the great doors of the Fatimid Caliphal Palace dating to the 11th century, preserved at the Museum of Islamic Art of Cairo. This series of panels has a very interesting story because it's not just that wood is ideally scarce and expensive in Egypt. This is an issue actually dating to, say, Ptolemaic times, when Hellenistic siege engines, right, were starting to be a thing. But exactly for this reason, the panels that belong to the old Fatimid Caliphal Palace were preserved in the moment of the latter's demolition and subsequently reused in the early Mamluk era to rebuild the Maristan, that is the hospital of Kalaum, right? That when in ruin and almost completely demolished, however, rendered us back this original wood, and especially a carved frieze from which we can get an interesting amount of combat and hunting scenes. We see maces, mostly with elongated heads, swords that are straight, and either double-edged without quillon or double-edged with quillon, or single-edged as well. It's a very interesting combination. You see that bias of the single bladed chopping weapon that is sort of more typical, in fact, of these southern Mediterranean shores. However, also the continuity of the older Iranian sword tradition that had spread, like from to the Celtic world, to the Roman one, the same Persian and later Arab tradition. We know from written sources that there were infantry weapons in this Fatimid era that may find a term of comparison in the same carved frieze regarding these long-hafted spears, like however with large blades, right? That thus are properly pole arms, and as such, these staff weapons can look really very similar to halberds, bills, glaive, the same type that Europeans were using in the same period. I made a video about pole arms that discusses partly this sort of not really prehistorical times, but almost regarding these mostly peasant weapons, but not only, because pole arms are more like they're more frequently popularized for the later Middle Ages when they're more categorized. In any case, remember that they were always an important component, especially in this time in history when cavalry already had the upper hand, but let's say not so much as it would gain later, and especially importance later. In Egypt, as we were just pointing out, had a greater infantry tradition than other areas of the Islamic world, and one that would also remain even during the Seljuk, the Mongol era, so to say, even though outside, of course, of the same Egypt in that case. We do not know, of course, too much about the specificities, the categories of pole arms of this era. We see from one of these carved panels all circular shields, right? So the idea that the later Yanubiya start becoming more frequent in the latter part of the 11th century reinforces the one that these shields, the other shields, would have in fact been developed mostly as a consequence of the contact between the Levant and more direct Western warfare. In particular, we're talking again, as we were saying before, about the Italians, mostly also not just because of crusading warfare, but because in fact of quite intense trade that existed between Egypt and Venice, mostly Yanubiya, obviously meaning Genoese, right? Nicole was very enthusiastic of this idea. Actually, he mostly tended to make the other way around, like as a point concerning like the influences that the Levant had in Western warfare. We'll talk about that as well. However, I would add that aside from the fact that, say, the actual shape and let's say more technical data of the Yanubiya, especially for this early data, are somehow obscure. For this early date, are really obscure. The say the areas in the Levant, but also in Europe, that were more exposed to missile warfare, and in the case especially of Eastern Europe, the Balkans, and also the Levant, mostly having to do with meeting with sort of steppe warfare, with horse-archery, in the case of Egypt, mostly, as we were saying before, against the Seljuks, to an unprecedented level, at least, would bring to the further development of these shields, and or also their appearance, and as a general evidence from the time. As we always say, the Islamic world is much less documented for the medieval, for any era, telling the truth, compared to the West in particular. But it makes sense, of course, that such larger sort of kite-shaped shields, also with sometimes a flat base and properly flat also in their own, in order to allow some sort of shield wall as a protection against missile, are sort of the most obvious reaction that we can see in many other areas. I will not digress on the Pavis again. I will make a video about that, because I realized that there are so many gaps in spite of my almost 2,300 videos, mostly about medieval warfare, about these topics, that must be properly explained. In any case, we see also smaller shields on this source, handheld types, right? There are also very large ones instead, and seemingly slung across the wearers' backs. This is quite interesting. There were different types of shields, of course, and just think about how, I don't know, even a guy with a double-handed axe would fight in that way. It's not something we see much in this era, but say for Egypt, you have the late medieval Mamluk tabardaria, for example, that of course would have not sort of appeared out of the blue. Egypt would have had such forces, especially as infantry fighting on foot, of course with double-handed weapons. And so everything is really possible. We don't see much armor though. So that's yet the other thing, like that these shields, especially in terms of extensional protection, were developed probably also because of the lower amount of armoredness compared to, again, always Europe, the Frankish world as a general comparison. I say the West to make the long story short, you know what I mean. We see helmets though, probably of conical type, one fluted. There are, like, the art can be quite crude, etc., but we see on the other some kind of neck protection, aventail, coif, or extended neck guard. We don't understand, which would be also typical a bit of the Levant, also the Middle East, as far as, in fact, the higher presence of missile warfare, at least in a quantitative amount of bolts compared to the West is also debatable, but yeah, I mean, horse-archery in the East produced much more arrows, but actually these weren't that particularly performing as, say, I don't know, a Western crossbow, for example, so we should always balance things out, all considered. But again, less armor means, at least in this case, more armor in relative terms where it matters. And of course, you had to leave your hand unprotected to, say, your neck to a degree, at least that can be, in order to see if anything, that can be covered by a shield. So you would have maybe poor armor with a shield that could cover your body, but sort of more neck protection. We see also in the second shield a forward tilted crown, which is actually very similar to the Western and Byzantine forms, more or less of the same years. Again, something shared, really. Even though it should be pointed out that this particular evidence is pretty early in time, so it's possible that some of these forms may have originally developed in the Eastern Mediterranean. There's all a thing about the actual shape, like the forward angled crown type of element, almost Phrygian caps-like, and we can't find it up to England, but let's say they wouldn't make this overwhelming difference in actual combat. There was surely some practicality in it, such capacity to even just intercept projectiles and some kind of protrusion and or just a higher helmet or cap than the average, if anything, also to defend, to protect the posterior ranks. In any case, it's only, let's say, in the 12th century, however, that we see Western Europeans bringing this forward angled crown to unprecedented levels, also for these areas, right? We may even think that this representation, coupled with those pole arms like the glaives, halberd, etc., was meant to represent the same Westerners, the same crusaders, which, as we will see now, is not at all strange. We have fragments of painted paper dating to the 12th century, so we're talking either Fatimid or early Ayyubid Egypt, now preserved at the British Museum in the Department of Oriental Antiquities, London. This is a fragment coming from Fustat specifically. It's probably depicting a battle between Islamic and Crusader fighters. The latter are even accurately drawn, and the possibility here is that the artist was well acquainted with them, and not just because of, say, crusaders, Muslims warfare, but against one another, but because there were lots of Westerners, even as allies, like mercenaries, but also, of course, invaders or prisoners that had been seen in Egypt quite often by this point, by the mid-12th century. Remember that warfare is not just like the greater potential destroyer of civilization, but also its actual one of its greatest hybridizers. And so it's nothing really strange. We should talk a bit also more about the presence of Western mercenaries in Islamic powers in the Mediterranean, aside from the eventual conquest of the Crusades, of the Reconquista, also on other fronts. We know that Southern European soldiers serving in Fatimid armies in the late 11th century were mercenaries. And so, again, Egypt was pretty well connected with the West, and there is nothing strange in seeing such degree of accuracy in the depiction of Western fighters. We see a knight with a typical 12th century forward tilted helmet, mail coif, long mail halberd, kite-shaped shield. There is a heraldic device shown. The guy has a spear, high saddle with prominent pommel and cantle. So yeah, this is typically Western stuff. And again, it's amazing that it was represented so accurately, even considering all the sort of awareness of these forces in the Egypt of the time. Then there is another crusader with a low conical helmet, a heavy straight sword, and a small round shield. We see behind him a particularly non-European type of spearhead of the wasted, let's say, variety. That probably here belongs to a figure that we can't see in the fragment, right? Now this is interesting because, of course, like they weren't making a perfect portrait, and there would have been, of course, troops, and we've seen it episodically, at least for the episodic videos that treated this. Of course, like local elements from the same Levant and also the surrounding regions that would fight for the Crusaders as well as subjects, and or of course, like any kind of possible variety you can imagine, like existing in medieval arms and armor, to render this figure not so typically Western for that matter. The Crusaders are attacking a castle, right? And so again, with them, we see essentially typically Western kind and allies, maybe, I don't know, Armenians, this kind. We will cover this in other regional warfare episodes, right? So the Muslim forces that defend the stronghold from the Crusaders are depicted, in fairly conventional ways. They are wearing turbans. You can't see them all because they're just, some part of their upper part is shown. The turban colors are, just for the record, red, ochre, and mixed pink and ochre, which is in general like a bit the entire tone of this fragment, admittedly. Two of these turbaned warriors have long-sleeved mail halberds. This is interesting because it's importantly heavy type of armor that reaches to the knees. Two types of shields are present, both of the kite-shaped form. There are, however, fighters with smaller handheld types of shields that are close to what we see in Byzantine sources. These are hung apparently from the battlements of the castle. We've seen actually that the Egyptians did have this proto-heraldic devices properly sculpted, if anything, on the major fortress gates, etc., were symbols of power and so on. In this case, they are actual shields, like in the way they are depicted, but of course we can imagine, of course, that trend to have started with actual shields. This was the case also in Europe at times. We see other foot defenders using a large shield that is specifically used to counter like the hooves of a horse, which is a very interesting, like not such crucial but still very interesting way of using a shield, because horses, even after the charge is over, they're stopped, like they're actually trained war horses for aggressing in that manner, biting, kicking, punching. So it's very interesting. We see yet some sort of Januvia shield or mantlet in the evidence, if anything, because of the size. The flat the bottom seems to be round rather than flat, for example. The infantry spears are interesting. There are double barbed blades, which however seem probably like an artistic license, given that they wouldn't have much sense. Also, the lower barbs seem to rather represent the socket. We see a bow that probably fits like the broader Fatimid types of the time. It's used apparently by an infantryman, like if anything, because he's a guy on like in the cast also, at least in that case, like he would be the one to shoot at the assaulters from a stationary position. We have, as we said before, no great evidence of an overly developed archery, or even a great deal of horse archery for 12th century Egypt. The point we were making before, of course, the Fatimids had missile troops, they had archers, etc., but it seems that javeliners, and also that, in fact, more typically Berber, or just even within the Arab tradition from the other side, bias for, in fact, closer range combat rather than horse archery was more of a Turkic influence, is still, in fact, a thing. We have ceramic fragments from late 12th century Egypt preserved at the Benaki Museum of Athens. This is from the inventory 391, and unfortunately it's a broken lusterware piece showing essentially male hauberk but also male shows, which is quite interesting because it shows that Egyptian troops also were, at least in the elite, particularly well armored, and of course because this country was, as we explained in the last episode, a particularly sound one also in terms of sort of established military capacity and sort of semi-permanent forces. The surcoat and the horse's equipment really tell us that we're talking about an Islamic warrior. Male shows in particular, as you know, were pioneered by Europeans, right? But we do have documentary evidence for them, of course in other areas, but specifically in certain Arab ones, where they were known, in fact, in the local language as Khalsat Zarad. I presume that Khalsat, I don't know the etymology here, I didn't check, but it's the same one of shows, right? So Khalsa also in Italian, and so pretty much meaning the same thing. We have yet another ceramic fragment from the same place, except it's inventory 423. We do not know whether it's Egyptian, but it's likely dates to the 12th century, and it shows a male bard, right, used by a rider. So yet another heavy element that makes this Egyptian knight sort of slightly similar, more similar to the Europeans than their other Islamic counterparts. We have the so-called sword of Salah al-Din ibn Ayyub, this is likely not, of course. It's an actual sword from actually the early 14th century. It's preserved at the Army Museum of Constantinople. I refuse myself to call it Istanbul. And there is no association with Saladin, right? Nevertheless, it's a very beautiful original weapon, and it may seem actually European in manufacture, at least as far as the blade is concerned. This would be sort of typical. Nevertheless, even the blade is fairly broad and rather non-tapering for, say, late 13th or early 14th century standards, where we've seen it even in the southernmost European regions, like, the blade was actually tapering, was very much anti-armor, because there was a lot of armor around, especially also one of the areas which these panoplies were more advanced. So this could actually suggest some kind of local European influence in Egypt, but also, in fact, a native way of making. Right. For example, at least for the rest of the sword, like the decorated key on the collar, enclosing the lower part of the grip, are fundamentally Islamic in tradition. There are many similarities both in archaeological and, say, manuscript illumination evidence. We have an inlaid brass astrolabe made by Abd al-Karim, Egypt, 1236. It's preserved at the British Museum, inventory 12557-291. This is essentially figural inlay, which at this time was fading in Egyptian metalwork. You see it more in Mesopotamia, in Persia. It's, however, mostly during the Mamluk era that this sort of goes by. From this evidence, we get a broad triangular bladed dagger with an apparent tassel on its hilt. We've seen in other videos how these massive compact triangular blades can be the precursor of the basilar dagger. Here we are again at the beginning of the 13th century, and this weapon is particularly fashionable in late 13th, 14th century Europe. There are hints to suggest that it may have originated from the Eastern Mediterranean, from Levant. In this context, the functionality of these weapons was mostly to stab in and protect, let's say, in the joints of what was starting to be used more frequently, plate armor, or like in this more, in fact, armored context in general. Right, so there is at least a functional. There is a rational explanation for, of course, its functional spread. We see this type of weapon is appearing slightly earlier in crusader manuscripts. I made a video about the, let's say, ultramare warfare and what, in fact, especially from the Kingdom of Jerusalem, we get regarding the iconography. This is also true for Italian art. That you would imagine, again, through trade being closer to Egypt and the Levant, of course. This is, again, a possibility. It wouldn't be so strange, but the question is, why would that have it originated in the Levant, right? Can't we just think that maybe it's the other way around? Maybe that Europeans that were exactly at that point experiencing a larger spread of heavier armor would need these weapons more, and that even if there were some designs around the Mediterranean, this may be, if not an accident, something that they don't really even need to take a specific inspiration from. In any case, we will at some point come back apologically on such issues. We have decorated or enameled glass mosque lamp from 14th century Egypt, so we are in the Mamluk era. This is now preserved at the Museum of Islamic Art of Cairo. We see the armorial ranks, so-called properly, not ranks like in English, but the actual ranks, like the proto-heraldic, essentially. Heraldry is mostly a modern discipline rather than a medieval one, but you understand what we mean here. Some shields that are displaying particular coats of arms that you can't necessarily describe as something so dynastically customized like in Europe, but that definitely bear semblance of a great Western influence, right? This may have been again the case, like Egypt, a much more landed society, much more stable, say, ensemble closer to Europe would get more likely influence also as far as power representation. We were talking about the shields before and the gate ways, etc. So we see also pretty interesting symbols like the eagle that, as you know, is still like used on the Egyptian banner today, and that some say it's European in influence. Yes, in the sense that like when you find it more distributed from an iconographic point of view, you can think about not just the West, but the Byzantines, obviously, all the Seljuks of Rome, right, of Anatolia. Think about the double-headed eagle in particular. But we will come back on that specific eagle iconography during the Middle Ages. In any case, the eagle would have been such, or the hawk. I mean, think about even Horus in very ancient Egypt, of course, how sort of universal of a symbol it would have been. Another motive in these rank emblems is the cup, which is also very, very Mamluk. Like we don't find it elsewhere, and it actually could signify the office of cup bearer to some senior Mamluk, in fact, covered by the owner of this coat of arms during his career at some point. Remember that the Mamluks established a veritable military regime that was very sort of self-referential in terms of value system and internal ranking and so on. So we unfortunately don't have all the details we would like, but that could be really an important function. After all, there was a Kurfürst also in Germany, so some concepts can be shared in this way. Now, at the Chester Beatty Library of Dublin, we have preserved Nihayat al-Sul manuscript, this case dating to 1366 and coming back from Mamluk Egypt. Egypt may have been the original, it's a birthplace of this manuscript. Of course, is famous because it came out, of course, in different copies. This one is one of the earliest as well as finest. We see later examples copied in Syria that at this point during the Mamluk domination, of course, would be connected with Egypt. In fact, they're all very similar, right? In any case, what interests us is the kind of military detail in the illumination. For example, body armor. We see an iron helmet, short-sleeved coats for riders. We understand that there was a stitch pattern like hanging, out of this armor. So this is probably male-lined Kazaghan's garments. We do not understand, however, pretty well from the actual art whether it's actual, say, padded cloth or armor, because they would have been also colored and sort of decorated in ways that unfortunately do not help very much the distinction. We see square-headed maces for many of the riders. They're beneath their saddles. We see long spears, also shorter ones, curved sabers, which, especially after the Mongol invasions, would have become really popular. Also in Egypt, that was able to fence off the Mongols. Remember, many of the Mamluks came originally from the steppes themselves as slaves, but they weren't all slaves. Sometimes were troops that came to become that in Egypt, but that had emerged from, in fact, the bowels of the steppes and decided that it was better to live as slaves in Egypt than as freedmen in the steppes. Of course, we see straight, probably double-edged tapering sword, which suggests some important anti-armor capacity. It has a pronounced pommel. The sense behind all these pictures is a very strong sense of horsemanship that is particularly, in fact, Mamluk in bias. We see probably in the helmet and shield some cartridges of blazing naft. There is liquid fire attached to them. This is really interesting for many reasons. We'll talk more about naft. The Mamluks were early, say, precocious firearms users. The naft, of course, was a thing that dated back to antiquity. At least this is the Arab name for the naft, essentially, in fact, as it was also derived in English from. And that apparently the Egyptians, for some reason, may have made a larger use, and or it's sort of better documented for them. If anything, in part, according to me, is that they used more infantry, like they fought in more urbanized realities, so a bit for that sort of more applicative stability of positional warfare during sieges, etc. They would have used this more, say, than the Seljuk Turks that were just on horseback. But here we see riders having that, which is crazy, because you imagine this, naphtha throwers on horseback, which, however, makes sense in certain circumstances. We will talk in other videos about these incendiaries more than explosives that, in fact, are a mix also at some point, but they were tiny, say, a tiny element of the overall, of course, even just firepower of these armies. The shield bearing the naft is of a larger form, perhaps the so-called tours, carried also by another horseman. Think about the late Roman plumbate lodged in the inner part of the shield, right? With in specific lodgings created for them, right? So there are interesting parallelism, even though here we're talking about very different weapons. Now, a brief mention of Byzantine influence in Egyptian warfare during this period. At the Victorian Albert Museum of London, we have a fragment of a lustreware plate dating to the 11th to 12th centuries. This is Fatimid Egypt. And we see how much influence there is in, especially a handheld kite-shaped shield for a warrior on this fragment. The guy has a short tunic, trousers, leggings, so this makes him essentially a foot soldier, because the riders would have had another gear, another dress. There is a tall shield, which is also pretty much the infantryman's defense. In Egypt, as we observed before, this was probably more the case than in other parts of the Islamic world. Unfortunately, we can't see the bottom of this shield, because had it been like, again, the flat type, we could have even compared it to the Yanui as we came to stereotype this type of shield. The fighter carries a spear or javelin. He has a turban. On the left arm, he has perhaps, however, this is quite interesting, a different, at least on the fragment, the arm is depicted in another color, which could be some sort of armor or wrapped cloak, right? This is something that even connects it to ancient Hellenic art in theory, but it's likely not the case. Nevertheless, it's important to point out, remember what we said before about the more exposed parts of an unarmored guy, of course, wanting to be armored, needing to be armored. This could be some some case of it. And something you don't see too much, a sort of manica, essentially, like the one of the ancient Roman legionnaires. But there are so many parallels in, say, medieval warfare, at least in this asymmetric way, especially for a guy that is evidently not armored otherwise. And so it can be different things. Even just a wrapped cloak can provide with some degree of protection. As a matter of fact, if you don't really have anything else, with all those flaming naftas flying around, it is possible. At the Louvre Museum of Paris, we have a fragment of painted paper dating to Fatimid Egypt, dating between the 11th and 12th centuries. This is also very, very interesting. We see essentially a lancer on horseback. We do not understand whether he is armored or not. He has perhaps mail visible, at least on his shoulders. There were, as we've seen, especially in the Islamic world, some solutions for which, like, mail would be covered by some sort of garment, and it's possible that, especially his shoulders, in the cases of a cavalryman, would be more reinforced for some reason. We see, however, a distinctly drawn shield of the small handheld kite-shaped variety. This is actually typical of the Byzantine world, especially between the 11th and the early 12th century. It's not flat-based, which sort of makes sense because it's wielded by a rider, right? But this Byzantine connection, especially, is quite interesting because before, especially the arrival of the Seljuks, as you know, the Byzantines had been quite active in reconquering, especially some regions of the Levant, like Syria, and essentially pointing to Jerusalem itself. And so we're talking about a great proximity between Constantinople and Egypt in this time in history, and so the connections are kind of obvious. Then the Crusaders arrive, and basically by the time they leave, the Byzantines are reduced to a smaller thing. But there would still be some influences of that kind. We've seen it in the video about Byzantine regional warfare, that there is some stuff that was used in Egypt we find in Byzantine iconography as well. Then talking about something more typically, if not strictly Egyptian, but say Islamic, that can be intended as more native to the region, or something, a legacy of an older Islamic tradition. We have an early piece of essentially a bronze sword pommel and Kion from Egypt, dating as early as the 10th, 11th century. This is also preserved at the Louvre. Also, the same dating and origin are debatable per se, right? The shape of the Kion, with this short sleeve extending below them to enclose the same top of the scabbard, may date it to this specific point in history. The most interesting aspect of these Kion is, however, an inscription that runs over the two faces of the same. That is unequivocally from the Surah 112 from the Quran. This surah is very much connected with not just the jihad, but the anti-say Christian effort. This is known as the al-Tab, the unity, right? That essentially compares Islam to other faiths. So it's possible that this type of sword, you understand, this may be earlier actually than the Crusades in the Levant itself, was provided with this inscription during, of course, like the many fights that existed between Islam and Christendom, but in the aforementioned context of Fatimid Byzantine clash, which is interesting. And you would have similar, especially this kind of engravings, incisions, and so on, are more typical of the high Middle Ages or early Middle Ages as well in certain cases. Later on, we don't find so many of them in this articulated fashion. Say the Vikings had a lot of that. Now it would be interesting how Islam had to do with, say, with these cultures and how much it was shared, because technically with Christianization we see much less on Western swords of this engraves, and not like crosses or, you know, still like, I don't know, firm marks, etc. But there is more of this in Islam, so it would be interesting to also understand why. I have some ideas, but now it's not so important to digress on them. At the Schweizerisches Landmuseum of Zurich, we have a helmet that dates to the 9th to the 10th centuries even. We do not even understand where it was done. Like, it was found at Kamelsen. So it's actually an early piece, but it's important to point out because it is one piece in construction from a single piece of iron, which is something that at the time in Europe you don't really see. So we're still talking about the so-called golden age of Islam, which definitely had a lot of technological quality to it, especially in areas like, in fact, Egypt, Syria, Mesopotamia. But we don't understand exactly where this was made, but the type of helmet is known as baidiyya in Arabic. There are very similar ones found in Tunisia. I talked about this in the video about North African, say, non-Egyptian warfare, of course. You see narrow straps across the bow of the helmet that are really decorative, right? There may have been a broader brow band to strengthen the rim. We do not know too much in detail, but it's, again, important to point out that Egyptian military technology was pretty advanced. It would remain that throughout all this time. Then we have a fragment of a broken lusterware from Fatimid Egypt. We are between the 11th and the 12th centuries, preserved at the Museum of Islamic Art of Cairo. It's a broken bowl that was restored in ways that, of course, like sort of added a bit to the missing pieces, and so are not reliable in terms of straight historical evidence. We see bare-headed men with unwounded turban clothes, apparently draped across their chests. Both have tiraz bands around their upper arms, which band were of some higher social status. You know, the tiraz band is sort of a rank insignia even on the arm that would be quite important in warfare as a mean of recognition. That's why, again, people of higher status were also fighters, of course. Both these figures wield staffs in their right hands. We see a small round buckler, probably had by both figures. The two guys are probably training. There's some kind of mock combat in action. This is what we understand from the art. At the Louvre, we have some carved wood panels from Fatimid Egypt, again, 11th, 12th centuries roughly. We see one figure on horseback, holding, together with the reins, probably a weapon, right? We do not understand clearly. It can be a sword without key on, or maybe some long-headed mace. These are metal staves of sort. We do not really have any of it archaeologically, but we know them being an actual thing at the time, because they are importantly represented. The helmet is, say, the headgear at least, maybe in fact either a pointed cap or a segmented or fluted head armor. There's a carved ivory plate from still Fatimid Egypt, 11th, 12th centuries, preserved at the Staatliche Museum Dahlem in Berlin. We see here a hunting man with a broad-handed spear that is similar also to other found, for example, on the decorations of the Fatimid Caliph's palace. We have another carved ivory plate from the same place and the same date, etc. Same place, I mean, of preservation in Berlin and the same era, the same region. That shows short-hafted spears with large heads and with a pennon beneath. The large bladed spears have insignia of rank, weapons thus serving as insignia of rank. This is the case since the earliest days of Islam. We can look a bit more into those ceremonial and even religious symbols, but the sacred weapons, as you know, were a pretty sort of international deal. We have a fragment of painted paper from the same era and region, this one preserved at the Museum of Islamic Art of Cairo. The inventory number is 13801. We see a fighter with a large shield with a central boss and numerous decorative rivets. We do not see the lower part of the shield. It was probably of the kite-shaped variety. We see probably some armor on the guy. There is another figure next to him carrying a pair of weapons with so-called wasted blades we were talking about before. They're probably javelins, right? The fact that there are multiple ones points at that. Remember what we said about Fatimid missile tradition being still very much connected with the early Islamic one, the Arab one, javelins rather than arrows. The fact that these guys are on foot is also important because it reinforces the idea that Fatimids had important infantry forces, like including, of course, like especially see with this big shield, like say bulky infantry of some sort, plus of course skirmishers to support them. From a carved ivory plate coming from 12th, 13th century Egypt, so it's either Fatimid or Ayyubid times, preserved at Museum of Islamic Art of Cairo number 5024, we see an infantryman with apparently split-sided riding boots. Right, he also has a large round shield across his back. This may be actually a dismounted horseman, and a trace of that sort of Kurdish-Turkic injection that especially the Ayyubid period witnessed in Egypt. From Ayyubid Egypt, dating to the same year of the Battle of At in 1187, we have a relief carving present at the main gate of Kalal al-Jindi. We are in western Sinai. This iconography is quite fascinating, as it bears an inscription dedicated to the aforementioned victory. This is just, by the way, months before Jerusalem would fall, so just after Hattin, but not before the fall of Jerusalem. A dedication, let's say, that is, we know it because we have specifically like the Mamluk. This is between July and August 1187. That is decorated by a shield. Remember those shields we were talking about before, both on these gates and on the rank emblems on the glasswares and other places. Actually, it could be on both. Well, this shield has decorated boss. It's a round shield. It has 4 large decorated rivets, which probably attach it to the enan, or that is the holding straps. There is crossed with a shield a sword of the straight but non-tapering type. It has prominent quillon and a heart-shaped pommel. The latter feature in particular is quite similar to the 13th century sword of Saint Ferdinand, one that is essentially a Andalusian or broadly Spanish item that is called at least the sword of Saint Ferdinand, but it's actually like something else, so someone else's, let's say, better. We will see it soon because I will make a video about Andalus soon, relatively soon. Then at Pierpont Morgan Library of New York, in manuscript 581, we have the manuscript illumination, painted parchment depicting Ptolemies of Nicantor. This comes from a Coptic author, and the image essentially represents the Gnostic mystic riding a horse that appears to be wearing some form of chanfron, or maybe some head covering, as well as a fabric caparison. This is fascinating. We do not really have any other illustration, I think, of horse armor in Fatimid art. This may not be, let's say, metal armor, of course. It's rather padded, if it is, like, not just some sort of simple fabric. We do know, however, through several documentary sources, that a narrow elite of Egyptian cavalry would actually use horse armor. This is a very interesting topic we will document mostly in the military historical unit series in depth, but it's a bit of a vexata question considering that, especially in the West, horse armor is not that common in general, even for particularly heavy cavalry. And so we see, however, in part because of some steppe influence, the presence of this metal armor, horse armor, for different countries, including Hungary. We see it for the 12th century, we see it here for still the Fatimid era in Egypt. So that's an interesting aspect. Just again, a limited type of armor. We do not see, say, the Nicephorian cataphracts that actually the early 12th century at least would have been out there still in the Byzantine Empire. And it would be interesting to know, in fact, to which kind of unit this force would belong in Egypt. We're talking about just isolated, say, customized type of armor, at least to a degree for an officer, not for an entire unit, right? From the fragment of a painted paper dating to the 12th century, so Fatimid or early Ayyub period, preserved at the Care Collection, number 113, London, we see a broadsword with a lanyard from the quillon down the blade. This may be, again, a specifically Egyptian thing. We have a carved relief on alabaster of an urn base. This dates to the 12th century as well, and it's preserved at the Museum of Islamic Art Inventory 4328. You see here a guardsman, likely, with an inverted sword. This is a somehow popular motive in Western Islamic art. It may have stemmed from Sasanian royal iconography, as a matter of fact. The sword in front of the body. The sword is straight and barely tapering in form. So again, this is interesting mostly for chopping, but still with an important, a pronounced anti-armor capacity of direction in the evolution of these swords. We see an almost trefoil shaped pommel, and we have an important source, the Tabsira Arbab al-Albab by Murda ibn Ali al-Tarsusi. This is the complete title of a quite unique manuscript. The way the title could be translated is, say, a way how to enter battle, basically, with the methods, and being, say, trying to avoid injuries and having sort of other insight about equipment, machines to fight the enemy, more or less. It dates to early Ayyubid Egypt, so we are in the late 12th century. It's preserved at the Bodleian Library, manuscript 264. That is Oxford, of course. It was a manuscript written for Saladin himself by a man from Alexandria of Egypt who was probably of Armenian ancestry or origin. The manuscript has many beautiful images that really provide us with a unique type of insight on weapons, arms and armor, siege, machinery, as they are described in the text as well. Right? Not everything, however, is so straightforward. Right? So some license may have occurred, but especially this interest for technical aspect is fascinating. There are lots of different things like arrow guides for the bows, different types of caltrops, right? So expressing the best what could be, like in the Ayyubid era, some of the most complete armament of the Egyptian military. An interesting aspect is also the actual terminology, like the Arabic for this very specific types of armor, again, and devices at some point. There is, for example, the ZR, just for the record, a large frame-mounted weapon known in Europe as an espringale, right? And this is an important, like, catapult, still, using twisted skeins of silk and horse hair. Like, it's again, it would eventually evolve into some sort of even one-hand crossbow, like especially in later medieval times. But still, right, there is a great deal of military technology depicted in this way. It would be also too long to literally explain every single detail. For example, in this case of the framework of the ZR, right? But there are, for example, 3 such weapons mounted one above the other in one instance. So some of it would be relatively, again, not necessarily poetic, but something really pushing far, like the fantasy of engineers, of technicians that evidently knew about these engines pretty well, right? In fact, there is a doubt on whether, for example, a machine like this could ever been used in battle, like at least in that specific design, because how useful, how applicable it could be. It is true, actually, that we don't know too much about all the experimentations carried out, especially in siege warfare, that was often a very ad hoc thing, as you know. We see, however, that this manual is surely designed to provide with an insight also at a court level, right? Some ideas that could be implemented by the actual commanders, all right? We see, an arrow shot from a miniature crossbow, some interesting lance bow interaction. There is another, some, again, strange ideas, some of which could even actually work, like the so-called shield bow, which may have, it could blend both, practicality of using the shield as a weapon as well, protecting yourself while we're reloading it, but we don't see much of it applied like in other contexts. So it's actual usefulness remains dubious. All right, we see a very good, for the times and places, illustration of a 12th century crossbow that is connected with aforementioned shield that otherwise it's not as equally interesting. We see the stock of the crossbow ending in a sort of knob or button comparable to the ones of late antiquity. Naturally, there is probably a lot of Hellenistic, Roman influence in this Egyptian tradition. Remember that many books, many manuscripts from those times had been preserved by Islam at this point in the Levant. They were still accessible. So the idea, especially that this guy may have been an Armenian that was in turn inspired by sort of Byzantine mentality, is that level of technologism is interesting, because some of these technology may have also remained accessible, if not like from the actual transfer of, of the same from the early Byzantine era to the Islamic one, in this knowledge that was to a degree venerated, because the general idea that a great power, this is a very Byzantine concept, had to be equipped with this very sort of strabiliant inventions as a proof of the ultimate, sort of like the cherry on top of a great military. There is a mangonel very similar to the one used by the Byzantines and the Franks at this point. Consider that it was in the same era like an invasion of Egypt by crusaders and Byzantines. At the point it went nowhere. This was at the time of Manuel Comnenus. We talked about it in the video about the Byzantine emperor. And you wouldn't expect actually the Egyptian mangonels to have been that different, as a matter of fact. This particular type of mangonel represented is also the simplest version of the stone throwing one, right? And in fact, this was very typical, especially of the early Middle Ages, like literally, powered by men pulling on ropes suspended from the end cross beam of the arm. We see again lots of stuff. 4 large siege crossbows mounted in a revolving wooden tower, each shooting multiple bolts at a time. And again, it's all plausible in theory, right? There is no technical impediment for creating such devices. However, it's obvious that the way they are represented here is just like a greater idea of all the various options, let's say, of the various, this idea of almost encyclopedical completion of all the various engines that you could think of, right? There are, in the text describing the machines, some details that do not make much sense, telling the truth, but hey, it's also like a high medieval manuscript, and it's sort of not much difficult to understand what it says, but rather like sometimes just a didascalic in for how things should be that doesn't necessarily align with the drawing or just with physics. And of course there may have been different sources of ideas, different authors at work there. We see yet another form of mangonel of this time Turkic Persian type. This was recommended for those grounds where it was easy to erect one to use, right? So with not much, let's say, resistance from the enemy, so you could simply smash better into like enemy fortifications. This actually wouldn't be particularly well suited for a nomadic people such as the Turks. So also the associations are sometimes debatable, but here we may think of, say, of course, the heavily Persified Seljuk Turks that had important of course, polyurcetic capacities. The Arab mangonel is described as the better one, right? The most effective, most accurate, at least among the man-powered ones. It's depicted in the way it could offer some degree of protection for the operators differently, especially from both the Byzantine and the Turkic ones. There is a wooden framework, right, to be employed. And again, as you understand, it's just a type of categorization that doesn't make much sense. Like, why wouldn't, I don't know, the Byzantines or the Turks be able to use it? But it's interesting to see how there were these ideas of how different peoples tended to use different styles of weapons. There was apparently in this Arab mangonel a hook on the arm that could adjust the range. It is quite fascinating. Then you see a trebuchet. This is possibly, considering the date, one of the earliest illustrations of such machine. These would essentially, as you know, supersede the mangonels during the 13th century at least. Other machinery was always used, all right, even of the simpler types. And at least one type here of trebuchet is described as a sort of an evolution of a Persian mangonel. It has a pretty complex release mechanism. There is sort of a hybrid with a crossbow in some cases, and nobody understands how, according to the text, it could be operated really by a single man. This very just like pulling, say, the trigger in a way, not really like the preparation of the entire machinery, the loading, etc. We understand, by the way, depending on the text description, that most of this artillery was not just like a fantasy thing, at least in the more, especially in the bigger types, like this machinery were known from quite a while. They had been sort of implemented over time, so they had a history, definitely. The author at a certain point describes even a smaller mangonel, the luab, operated just by one man, erected on the top of a single pole. This is almost like a staff weapon or so. It could be aimed in different directions. You could essentially do so without moving the entire machine, though, which is interesting. It's not, however, illustrated in the manuscript, right? Because, according to the author, it was so well known that so we're missing it. We have no idea what it is, except it was so well known at the time, and it may have been even the case, right? Then it's difficult, of course, to understand for whom really this manual was created. And of course, even here we talk about high levels, but the audience to which this author was sort of winking at by saying we all know what we're talking about, it's not that clear. Whether, I don't know, military engineers or in many ways things could have overlapped with commanders as well, but remember that Arab military engineers were imported even in China, so surely there was a great deal of activity, especially in the Levant, mostly influenced by Egypt, for probably the Mediterranean side, that would have been quite active in this sense. There is a crossbow known as the foot bow, with a nut device for propelling small bottles or eggs of naft, the aforementioned liquid fire. This is quite interesting for, imagine, like even anti-armor capacity, at least like for the naphtha entering the armor at the impact of these eggs, right? We see important details even about these weapons, but so now we can't simply digress on. We will do it in another video. But we see similarities also in this type of crossbows with the ones of 13th century Europe, right? In particular, this place for the foot while loading the bow with the base of the stock. So it's not all details, especially from like both in the text and in the picture, are clear. However, we see definitely something pretty accurate. We see mobile mantlets consisting of a frame holding up flexible webbing or hemp. Could be raised or lowered. So this was used, as you know, in later times. We've seen it for even 15th century artillery. During siege warfare, you open just in the moment in which you have to shoot, you so that you don't have the enemy, seeing it coming, but they can't see the actual loading. The usage being actually the same, the concept being really the same. We understand that all what is contained in this treaty may have easily been a very common type of, say, polyurcetic means, wisdom, capacity, stretching from the Middle East to Constantinople, dating back even to, Sasanian times, and having context also with China. I think about the Sino-Avar Mangonel had really played a role at some point. So there is a lot of Islamic Middle Eastern tradition, but such military technology would have certainly been known in other parts of the Mediterranean, such as al-Andalus, for example, but also what had been like Fatimids, Sicily, say, but surely in southern Italy there were similar devices. If anything, we should make more videos about siege warfare, because we tend to overlook how important the degree of urbanization was for the development of such weapons. Indeed, we had the opportunity of looking at Syrian militias, their defensive capabilities, connecting that with, in fact, the important centers existing in some regions. So all is blended, and this is not simply, okay, who had the best technology. It's also about why, in which context, for which kind of armies, right? So as you were saying before, Egypt distinguishes itself for being a sort of more civilized, urbanized, more state-like entity than the increasingly Persified and tersified, and in this sense feudalized and privatized system of the Middle East, right? Where likely, like, there were lots of very important, even the Mongols had very advanced artillery, but they had mostly taken that from China. They would invest Persia, so it's not like, especially among the sedentary countries here, there was one that was particularly lagging behind in terms of polyurcetics. We have rather to understand why, for example, in this case, there's all this extravagance around, say, and whether there was an actual use of each of these devices. What that means, unfortunately, it's in great part not reconstructible, but never underestimate how advanced military technology was in this time of the Middle Ages. Was heading also towards a peaking. In many ways was more advanced than also the one of ancient times. But they were also similar in scale. At the Museum of Islamic Art of Cairo, we have a broken ceramic plate dating to 12th century Egypt. This style is typical of late Fatimid ceramics. It may be that we're talking slightly later times, but it doesn't matter, because this artistic styles would also survive the individual dynasties. We see on this fragment like a horseman with a straight sword with an apparently flared hilt and decorative belt pendants of some sort, right? This makes it very similar to some Abbasid or even late Umayyad styles, which is interesting considering the proximity with Egypt in time and space between these powers. We have, of course, plenty of Mamluk stuff, including sabers. There's one preserved at the Topkapi Museum of Constantinople, dating between the late 13th and 15th. I mean, it is broadly Mamluk, right? And this was brought more by the steppe impact. What we see here, however, is that the Mamluks of Egypt, yes, were very influenced by the Turks. They were Turks in many ways themselves. There were some Mamluks that were really emerging as such as natives or people with mixed ancestry in Egypt, but there's also a lot of Mongol influence. Remember the Wafidi, some actual Mongols or Tatars at some point settled as refugees from the Golden Horde, from the Il-Khanid, in Syria mostly, but also in Egypt at some point. And what Egypt maintains is not that particularly curved saber style that the Turco-Mongols have, but if you look at the sabers, for example, you realize that they were almost straight, relatively heavy, right? And so adding not just a particular power to of course, if properly wielded, but also very much sort of anti-armor, made more to crash into hard targets than softer ones. Then, of course, one could philosophize on whether curved or straight blade does actually make this enormous difference, but we have to understand why, of course, this difference existed, and it's so sort of trendy in these specific times and places. And we will explain it better also in other, especially in the military historical units series. We have an inlaid bronze incense burner dating to the late 13th, early 14th century. We are in Mamluk, Egypt. This incense burner is preserved at the Museum of Islamic Art, Cairo, number 24078. We see here actually a sharply curved saber, however used by a horse archer with a turban, which tells us that, of course, this was the guy that would preferably use a carved saber for more effective cuts on, say, hit and run tactics. Like the physics of this word is somehow complicated, but since Xenophon, we know that the curved blade is more effective for cavalry use, but in the sense of also a less let's say hand-to-hand, like melee cavalry use, as a prolonged one, right? The more curved, bigger, the more straight, bigger saber would have been used like close range by, heavy cavalrymen that would have already broken their spears and fighting like in a stationary position, de facto, on horseback against one another. The horse archer was not even meant properly to engage into hand-to-hand combat, if not against its own similars that were lighter, right? They were less armored, and so a cutting weapon at full speed and touching that moment, causing that devastating damage to an unarmored opponent was enough, right? For heavier troops, you needed heavier weapons instead. We have a Kalilava Dimna manuscript preserved at the Topkapi Library. This manuscript has 363. It dates to the mid-late 13th century. Comes from Egypt. Here, so again, Mamluk era, in about essentially in whereabouts. Let's put it in this way, because again, we already saw in the previous video that it's not like the Mamluks arrive and everything is sabers, right? Already from before, changes had started occurring for quite a while. And we see, in fact, sabers of the both long, narrow, tapering form and the heavier, non-tapering style. This is quite interesting because it has like a wide array of purpose. We see a beautiful composite bow with angled ears, pretty straightforward illustration. One guy may be wearing a male hauberk. Some long sleeve striped and blue colored garment appears beneath a short sleeved and shorter hemmed outer garment. We often don't understand whether that blue is metal or actual, I don't know, some other colored garment, for example. But that seems like, again, there are, especially in the Islamic world, lots of these metal armors worn underneath some kind of garment. We have painted paper fragments from Fustat, Egypt, dating to the 13th to 14th century, preserved at the aforementioned Keir collection. This is number 126, London, in which a horseman carries a broad-bladed axe. Right, these probably are the Tabarzin saddle axes of written sources that show, in fact, some also important anti-armor function from horseback that is proper of that Mamluk Egyptian sort of heavier cavalry that is not, in fact, that lightly biased towards horse archery in the same way, say, the one of the Il-Khanids of the Golden Horde, or even the early Ottomans at this point start to appear. Think of Anatolia. We have a Coptic Gospel from Egypt dating between 249 and 50. This is preserved in Paris at the Catholic Institute. This is the manuscript Copt Arab 1. We see naturally lots of interesting, say, biblical scenes. It's sort of very similar to some Syrian art, predictably of other Coptic communities, but as we've seen for bows, like in other videos of that region, there are many Christian and Islamic features alike, obviously, in the style of representation. We do not see lamellar armor, that especially at this point you understand we're talking about the Egypt controls also Syria, right? Here the last crusader outposts have to fall, but the Mongols are already around, and so there is a lot of lamellar next to horse archery, and we don't see much of that. This is also part of the Christian style that was sort of more, I don't know, classical, sort of Roman, like that sort of more Byzantine influence idea of what is a Westerner, right? So that's part of the reason. Nevertheless, it's possible. Consider that this is actually Egypt. Like it's not. It's similar to Syrian manuscripts, but it's not from Syria. Because that's a feature, by the way, we notice also for Syrian Gospels. So this may actually add to the fact that, of course, Egypt was different from the more Mongol-influenced areas, and that male, just like in the West, was more popular than the much more, say, popular Eastern lamellar Yavshan, right? You see a lot in Persian art, for example. Some wicked enemies have some sort of wide-brimmed headgears, maybe helmets. These are actually similar to the ones seen on the Baptistère de Saint-Louis, that is a Mamluk basin that is providing with some of the greatest detail Mamluk military dress. I made a video specifically on that, so you can check it out for all the detail. I inserted actually the images here too, but they're more scattered. So this latter comparison may point to the fact that according to these Christian Egyptians, the same Mamluk rulers were sort of the bad guys, and as such they represented the same essentially connationals at that point, but of Islamic faith in that way that they would represent themselves. You see, there's a different art, right? With the Baptistère de Saint-Louis, you have that more straightforward Mamluk artistic self-depiction. Here instead, the Copts reasoned differently, of course, and they have completely different sort of artistic references. So it's very, very interesting. Then for the rest, we see straight swords, which is again meaningful. There are sabers as well next to them, but still. Then broad bladed spears, suggesting some lower level of armoredness of some sort, and axes, however, against the actually armored opponents. There is the beautiful Furusiya military treatise attributed to Hassan al-Ramah, dating to early 14th century Egypt, preserved at the National Library of Paris. This is the Arab manuscript 2825. There are lots of interesting figures. For example, we know from this manuscript of the great Mamluk advancement also in naval technology, military technology. Together with the Venetians, Mamluk Egypt was the most advanced power, not just in naval but in military technology in general. We see incendiary torpedoes to go on water, apparently powered by gunpowder rocket, beautiful, like fireworks basically, floating them. It makes a lot of sense if you think about it. Not particularly precise, but it's a bit like rockets as they were used also in the air. You have, in fact, lots of these rockets loaded with incendiary devices. For example, fire pots at the end that are shown, in this case, mounted in an ordinary spear, basically. So conceptually, also very primitive ideas, but still functional. Remember the naphtha, and we find incendiary grenades. This is yet another very beautiful technical manuscript. We see trebuchet drawn back by a windlass. We see the simple man-powered mangonel with a fire pot in its link. The Egyptians were somehow fixated with this. There were fire ships with grenades and incendiary fire pots on their decks, interestingly enough. There is all important aspects of naval design that we'll see better in another video. So the origins of all these devices are probably connected with actual Egyptian culture, but we don't see it. You don't see all this abundance, let's say, of ideas elsewhere. Again, Mamluk Egypt seems to have been quite precociously advanced system in terms of also firearms technology. However, they wouldn't last, as you know, against the Ottomans for long, but that's because a stagnation sort of kicked in towards the later generations of their existence. But otherwise, at this time, they were really something that were really very advanced manuscripts like this, that, as you see, have a continuity even from different authors from different times, really show. From a private collection in Germany, we have a bronze hand cannon that comes from Mamluk, either Egypt or Syria. It dates to the late 14th to the early 15th century. It's 24 centimeters in length. It has a bore of 8.5 centimeters. It's pretty light, 2.7 kilos, roughly. Guns like these are showed in 15th century Middle Eastern military treatises that are in turn based on 14th century originals, at least as they say, or we can reconstruct. We see the same type of military technology in Western Europe at this time. Again, it was spreading pretty much in the same ways, not just across Europe, but this other lands, right? So it's not much about the designs or the typology of weapons, but especially in this early era, right? Rather the amount of the spread. But Egypt, again, would have really been ahead compared to especially more steppe-influenced countries in Islam. We have an inlaid basin made for Hugh IV of Cyprus, and it's interesting because it's made in Mamluk style. So even though it was made for a Christian king, you know, it was among the Lusignans, and it's preserved at the Louvre Museum. There is a seated warrior on this basin, which is a zodiacal figure. He has a single-edged sword and wears a low helmet. It has apparently an almond tail plus some lamellar cuirass that protects only the torso of his body. So this a heavy guy, but of some lighter type compared to Western Europe. I made a video about the Cypriot military organization at this point, and also, let's say, these Christian lands were, however, somehow lighter in style, not just influenced by the Levant, but just ruling over peoples who were mostly Byzantine in character, so lighter than the Westerners. At the gate of Manjak al-Siladar, Cairo, there is a carved relief dating to 1346, in which we can appreciate a curved saber. This was a common design in this Mamluk proto-heraldry. It's interesting to see symmetrical quillon even for this curved weapon, as well as likely tassels hanging from the hilt of the sword. There is a ceramic fragment coming from mid-14th century Egypt, preserved at the Brooklyn Museum, inventory 72130, New York. And here we have essentially a dagger, right, with a tapering blade. It may have just had a ceremonial purpose, like killing animals or whatever, but such designs may have been used also for war. At the Metropolitan Museum of Art, Rogers Fund 41150, New York, we have an enameled glass bottle dating to early 14th century, either Egypt or Syria. It's Mamluk anyway. And there are figures on it that are similar to 13th century Seljuk art to a degree, because there was evidently an influence from Persia, and if anything also Mesopotamia, like Iraq, the Jazeera, right? There were frontier areas with Mamluk Egypt. One horseman has a mace while holding the bow. In the other hand, we see a recurved composite bow used from horseback in another figure. At the Ambrosian Library of Milan, manuscript 140, and different other, let's say, technical denominations. This is simply the Kitab al-Hayyavan. It dates to early 14th century Mamluk Egypt or Syria. We have an important amount of Mamluk as well as Turco-Persian fashions. Crescent-bladed axes, tight tunics. However, in other scenes that are still straight blades, only with a slight curve. We see them hanging from baldricks, and this is mostly, again, like an interesting mix of both Arabic and Persian styles, especially from, again, this more Turco-Iranian influenced Mamluks from one side, and the same Western Iran, say, resenting of that still Arab influence in the substratum of this otherwise sort of Turkic-dominated world now, Turco-Mongolian-dominated world. I thought actually this video would be shorter. I underestimated how much there is to cover about medieval Egypt, reason for which I will stop here for today. You understand how many different influences we have, how many, however, recurringly coherent data, right, regarding this sense of the Levant, of Egypt, of Syria, and whatever was in between, Palestine after it had been reconquered from the Crusaders and so on, was really sort of Western influence compared to the Middle East. All right, and this aspect is again pretty underappreciated to so many degrees that it's sort of difficult to simply leave it there, not to properly consider it as you would like. There is always obviously a lot to cover. It's not so easy as it seems at all. Nevertheless, for today I stop it here. I just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it, otherwise leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. As always, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.